Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us virtually here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. This program today is presented by the Maryland Center for History and Culture's Maritime Committee. Catch me who can, the design and deployment of the famed Baltimore Clipper. And I'm Margot Kopera, Public Programs Manager at the museum. Now for today's program, we are turning our attention to the unique legacy of the Tidewater schooner. MCHC's Museum Learning Manager and Associate Curator, Alex Lothstein, is facilitating this conversation with members of the MCHC's Maritime Committee. Thank you for joining us today, Alex.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm going to leave the rest for you. There's a lot to unpack.
All right, well, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to introduce everyone who's going to be on the panel, and they are turning their cameras on. The first person I want to introduce is Fred Leiner. Fred is a lawyer and author of 2 books. The books are The End of the Barbary Terror, America's 1815 War Against the Pirates of North Africa, and Millions for Defense, The Subscription Warships of 1798. And he's written 24 articles about American maritime, diplomatic, and legal history, including articles on privateers in the War of 1812. Fred also teaches legal history as an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, and Fred serves as the chairman of the MCHC Maritime Committee. I want to introduce Pierre Henkart, who's a lifelong sailor and retired scientist, having run an NIH immunology research lab for over 30 years and taught immunology in the NIH Graduate School. Over the years, Pierre and his wife have explored many corners of the Chesapeake in cruising sailboats, and for over a decade, Pierre has sailed as a guest crew on the Pride of Baltimore II, a Baltimore Clipper reconstruction. This very different sailing experience led to an interest in Baltimore Clipper history, including reliving several Baltimore Clipper privateering cruises in the War of 1812 by examining their original logbooks and associated documents in the MCHC library. Finally, I want to introduce Karl Kirkman. He is a retired naval architect and marine engineer who worked on projects as varied as highly classified national security projects to America's Cup design teams. He has had a lifetime interest in the craft that were specialized for service on the Chesapeake Bay and has published a history of the Baltimore Clipper. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
So I want to begin with a first question that I'm going to ask Karl. And so this is kind of the basic question. What makes a Baltimore Clipper a Baltimore Clipper?
Thank you. The first thing I need to say is that at the time period we're talking about, the vessels we're talking about were not called Baltimore Clippers. So what I want to do is to tell you that our working definition for today is it's a group of small sailing ships that flourished on the bay. And I want to show some examples in this picture. The upper left-hand corner is a Virginia pilot boat called the Swift. The upper right-hand is a Baltimore-built commercial vessel called the Flying Fish. And notice she has 3 masts, which is unusual for the typical Baltimore Clipper. The lower right picture is the Chassew, and the lower left is a slave ship called Dos Amigos.
Well, we know a little bit about the Clippers, but when and why did the Clipper design emerge?
First of all, let me say, this is a quick look at the family tree of all the different vessels that were either considered Clippers or related or developed from Clippers. And you'll notice it ends up with things as diverse as the Yacht America and, of course, what we think of as the traditional Clipper ships. To understand how the design emerged, you really have to talk for a minute about what's unusual about the Tidewater, because that's what drove this different kind of ship than what we had seen before. This slide shows an overall view of lots and lots of most of the bays that were in the colonies at the time. And as you can see, the Chesapeake Bay is the largest, and it also is unusual in the sense that it runs north to south, that is because there was a meteorite strike 35 million years ago. It created a huge depression in this area, which at that time was underwater. So as the waters receded, the rivers that fed into the Chesapeake all became connected together by what we call the Tidewater. And because of that, we end up with the area shown on the right a whole connection of lots and lots of different estuaries, but which generally runs north to south. Now, the reason that matters is not the direction itself, but how it relates to the wind. And so what I've shown here is what's called a wind rose. It's a graph that shows the typical wind speeds and directions at some location. A typical one is on the left, but the one that I wanted to focus on is the one on the right, which is a wind rose for the Chesapeake Bay. It has two very important attributes. The first one is that it primarily has winds blowing from the north and the south. And secondly, the winds tend to be rather light. And the reason that's important is that in order to be successful on the bay, a ship had to be able to tack and sail to windward effectively. And so we have to talk for a minute about what that means. A sailboat cannot sail directly into the wind. It can go with the wind and across the wind, but if it just heads into the wind, the sails just flap and it goes nowhere. So what matters in going to windward is not how fast the boat's going, but how much progress it's actually making to windward. And so a vessel that can point closer to the wind is faster if they have to go the same speed through the water than the same vessel that has to reach off to achieve that speed. That's simply speed through the water. Now, the other part of speed is actually might better be called nimbleness. If we could have, and what I've shown here is a diagram that shows what's called tacking on the left-hand side, where a sailboat goes in one direction and then shifts the sails and goes in the other direction and then shifts the sails and goes back in the original direction. And that's how a sailboat is actually able to work to windward. On the right-hand side, we see a comparison between what's called a fore and aft rig vessel, of which the schooner is an example, where the sails only briefly luff as the vessel tacks, and then she fills away and takes off in the other direction. And compared to that, we have a diagram of a square rigged ship, which had to go through a fairly complicated evolution to change from one tack to the other. So the schooner ends up with the advantage that it's not only tacks more easily with a smaller crew, but also is able to point closer to the wind. And that's really because of the bay being in north-south and with north and south light winds. Going to windward was very important. And that's really what led to the development of the schooners as the predominant vessel.
Okay, you mentioned that they weren't called clippers at the time. So what were they called at the time, and what does that name signify?
They were called many, many different things. They were called everything from Virginia schooners to tidewater schooners, privateers, slave ships. There were lots and lots of different vessels that are included in this group. And one example I have in this picture shows on the left-hand side a very early small Virginia schooner. You can see the small crew and the fore and aft sails. And on the right-hand side is the vessel that it replaced, which was a typical merchant vessel of the day, which was rather full-formed and slow and had a lot of square sails. So this picture sort of brings to mind the replacement of the older vessel on the bay with this new kind of vessel.
So Fred, I want to ask you a question. Karl took us through some of the models and mentioned different types of the schooners. Can you go a little bit more into detail of the uses of the Baltimore Clipper and how it was used kind of throughout history?
Sure. So in the late 18th century, when this design evolved, it was a time of continuous wars in Europe. And those wars spilled over into the Caribbean and into the Atlantic. And so there was a premium, instead of carrying a lot of cargo, there was a premium on the very attributes that the Baltimore Clipper had, which is to say speed and nimbleness to avoid being captured by the British Navy or the French Navy or the privateers of these different navies. So the first usage of these ships in Baltimore and throughout the Tidewater was as merchant ships. Then, as the United States got involved in the War of 1812, those same attributes were great if you could put a few light cannon on these ships to use them as privateers. And then following the war, although they were also used as privateers in the wars in South America for the liberation of the Spanish colonies in South America, they were also used because of their speed and nimbleness in the illegal slave trade. You may remember that as of 1808, the transatlantic slave trade was abolished, but this design was so fast that they could often smuggle slaves and other contraband type of goods. So towards the end of its career, the Baltimore Clipper had a sort of unfortunate history in terms of what it carried.
So I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. You mentioned the word privateer, and can you just explain the difference, what a privateer is, how that differs from a pirate, and how that played a role a little bit in its service?
Sure. So this is a very important point that's often missed by people. So privateers were not pirates. Pirates are outlaws. They're criminals. And we still have pirates today off of the Horn of Africa, for instance. And privateers were something very different. Privateers were privately owned, privately outfitted, privately managed vessels that in wartime could receive a license from its government to attack the merchant ships of the enemy. And so to prevent them from becoming pirates, the government required a bond, a surety to establish a bond so that what privateers did not become piracy. And once the privateer went out, if it captured enemy merchant ships and was successful in sending them back in to a port in America, there would be an adjudication in front of a United States District Court. And if the prize was held as valid under the rules, then the privateer owners could sell the cargo and the ship itself that was captured. And they would divide up after certain costs were taken out, they would divide up the profits. So it could be potentially a very lucrative business for those people who sailed on or owned the privateers.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail, but I want to kind of go back to Karl, because Fred mentioned something that privateers were needed for speed. They had to be fast. Was the Baltimore Clipper faster than the other contemporary designs at the time?
It was faster in two respects. The fact that it because of the large rig and the fairly light displacement, it was very fast through the water, and it was also much more nimble. And this is what made them so effective as privateers for capturing other ships.
So, Fred, Karl mentioned some benefits to the schooner. What were some of the reasons why it was a favorite besides just speed? Were there other reasons?
Well, Karl alluded both to speed and the nimbleness. Also, by the time of the War of 1812, this was a design that had really caught on in places like Baltimore and throughout the Chesapeake Bay. There were lots of shipyards that were able to make these ships. There were abundant numbers of sailors and masters who were used to them. And it was, once they could find some cannon to put on and get a license, it was a natural for the privateering business.
So it seems like there were a lot of benefits to the clippers being used. But Karl, I kind of want to throw back to you. Were there any drawbacks to the clippers?
It's not so much that there were drawbacks to the clippers, although they had some, but really what is important is how the attributes of various kinds of ships fit the demand at the time. And the reason the Baltimore Clipper went away is that because although it was very, very good for war, it was really not suitable for peacetime. It didn't carry much cargo. If you see the leg of the stool there, the ship exceeded it there. It was very good in speed, but it was low in survivability. They were dangerous and they were fairly lightly built. And so the very things that changed when the world changed from privateering to world trade, the world of the tidewater maritime business, the ships didn't have to just go to windward all the time. The trade routes of the world had a lot of downwind, and many of these Baltimore ships ended up sailing to places like China. So that when these kind of specialized ships were put into trade, they had a huge disadvantage. The only thing that was really left for those very specialized ships after the War of 1812 was the slave trade. And the slave trade was in the business of being eradicated at that time. And so there really was no use for these ships as the slave trade went away.
So we talked a little bit about the use as a privateer, the use afterwards, but I want to kind of flip a little bit to the construction of them because I think their construction is fairly important. And so Fred, where and how many shipyards built Baltimore clippers?
Well, the answer to that is dozens. So in the early period, there were shipyards, as this graphic illustrates, shipyards scattered around the bay. Quite a few of them were on the eastern shore in places like St. Michael's and Easton. But as Baltimore became more and more the center of entrepreneurship and of shipments overseas, Baltimore increasingly became the place for building the Baltimore clippers. There were always some shipyards left on the eastern shore and south of Baltimore on the western shore, but Baltimore was the center.
So in their use during the War of 1812, right, a lot of them were used as privateers, and we get this kind of saying that Baltimore was a nest of pirates. The British would call Baltimore a nest of pirates. And so Karl, does that mean that the only Baltimore had the privateers, or were there privateer fleets based elsewhere in the United States during the War of 1812? And were these ships considered clippers?
Baltimore certainly was the center of the activity, but as Fred said, privateering was a very profitable business, and that tends to attract people who want to participate pretty widely. And one of the reasons is that the owners of these ships would take away half of the value of the prizes if they were successful. So a lot of wealthy people all along the coast got involved, and the privateers were sort of the dot-coms of the day. Many of them were built in Tidewater, but there were also examples that were built elsewhere. This is a picture of the Prince de Neufchâtel, which was a very, very famous and successful privateer, which designed and built in New York and had New York owners, and in fact was captured sailing out of Boston. So these ships were along the coast in various places, although they centered in Baltimore.
So you mentioned about the owners and how they kind of spread out because, like, as you said, they were the .com of their time. And that's interesting. I kind of want to dig more into what it was like, to own a privateer and operate them. So Fred, I kind of want to throw you some questions. And the first one is, how many privateers did Baltimore actually have? Okay.
Well, research has shown that over the course of the 30 months of the War of 1812, there were 122 Baltimore-built clippers that got privateer commissions in Baltimore. Now, I put it that way because obviously ships can move about, and some Baltimore ships may have gotten licenses or commissions in other cities, just as Philadelphia ships or New York ships came to Baltimore and could get their licenses here in Baltimore. But really, to answer your question, 122 is the good number. Now, they came in surges. There was a huge initial surge at the start of the war because that was before the British could establish a blockade of the American coast. And there were other points during the war when there were surges of privateers going out. Because, and this is really the important point, the owners, who usually were in consortiums, wanted to maximize profits, because the important point of privateering was that, yes, there was a patriotic element to it. I mean, these people were Americans. We were fighting the British. There was a lot of resentment for the War of 1812 for a lot of British, what was considered high-handedness. But having said that, privateers were there to make money. And so the owners and masters who led these ships sailed at times where they thought the chances to maximize profits were greatest.
Mhm. So you mentioned masters and owners of these ships. Who are the owners? Are the owners the captains, or are they other individuals?
Well, that's a great question. So incidentally, shown right now is a man named Henry Dashiell, who at the end of the War of 1812 was the captain of a Baltimore privateer called the Saranac. Why she was called the Saranac, I don't know. I love this portrait, incidentally, because obviously he's a kind of a jaunty guy. The top hat was fairly typical, but the spotted waistcoat was not. Anyway, this is an example of a privateer captain. So let me get into a little of the detail about the owners and the way this thing worked. We know that there were approximately 100 entrepreneurs in Baltimore who invested in one privateer. We know that there were about 50 who had ownership shares in 2 or 3, and there were another 50 that owned 4 or more. Now, on the screen now is a certificate. There are very few of these surviving, but this is almost like an old stock certificate, if any of you remember what they look like. And what happened is, depending upon the cost of purchasing or outfitting or both a privateer, let's say it costs $40,000. An owner, the person who actually owned the vessel, could sell shares in that, let's say 10 shares for $4,000 each. Now, in this case, here's a share that cost $500, and there were 20 shares. So that privateer was apparently worth $10,000. It was a ship called the Warrior. But anyway, this was a method of spreading risk, because if one person owned the vessel and sent it out, yes, he could maximize profits, but he also bore the entire risk. And the owners had large costs. It was a question of arming them, outfitting them. They did not pay the crew wages, but they had to pay the crew. They had to provide the crew with food and supplies, medical care. So they had some real expenses that they incurred. Anyway, as I've identified, there were a number of people in the city of Baltimore who put a lot of money into these shares. And so some of them did really well, and some of them did very poorly. It runs the gamut. And so, again, some of it is based on the sailing ability of the ship. Some of it's about how good the master was and the directions and where to sail and what to try to capture. But also some of it was just plain luck. So let me just finish with this thought. There was one of the most unlucky entrepreneurs was a man named George Pitt Stevenson, who invested in no fewer than 13 privateers. And I believe he lost money on almost all of them. And he ended up the war losing $212,000, which was an enormous sum of money in those days. And he actually had to go into bankruptcy. But that's illustrative. So while some people thought this was a great investment, it was a very risky investment. And it would be like today, I like the .com analogy that Karl mentioned, but it also would be putting a lot of your money into a sector fund that was very speculative. And indeed, some people liken privateering to gambling. So I've covered the waterfront about the economics and the entrepreneurs, but it's actually a very interesting and complicated story.
Interesting. And so we kind of talked a little bit about, what the owners would get out of it. And you mentioned that the sailors weren't paid. So what would the sailors get out of it? What was the reason why they would join?
Well, it was privateering was a very capitalist enterprise. And what the owners wanted to do was to align everyone sailing on a privateer with the interest of capturing as many fully laden enemy merchant ships as they could. So everyone, this is a master of the Comet and Chassew. His name was Thomas Boyle, and he was one of the very successful privateer captains in the war. The captain served for shares, and each member of the crew had at least one share, depending upon what he did for the ship. And they signed a joint contract called the Articles of Agreement. And under those articles, they divvied up whatever profits they would have. And if the ship didn't make any profits, they didn't get any money. They got their sustenance, but they got nothing out of the venture because there were no wages paid at all.
So where would a lot of the information that you shared and kind of information that Karl shared, where would a lot of that information come from? How do you kind of get this information?
Well, unlike the Navy, which of course is a public good, and the Navy keeps accurate records, privateers were owned privately. And so the records for privateers could be in the dusty attics of their descendants. They could be, as is true with the Maryland Center for History and Culture, they could be in the archives of historical societies or museums. And there's also, of course, huge amounts of information about the operations of these ships in their logbooks. And of course, the MCHC has a great collection of the Baltimore privateers' logs.
So you mentioned logbooks, and I'm gonna I want to turn to Pierre, because Pierre, I know you have a lot of experience working with logbooks, and I kind of want to let you talk a little bit more about your experience with them. And so one of the questions, the first question I want to ask you is what information would typically be listed or reported in a logbook?
So a logbook has traditionally been used for many centuries before Columbus to note data that is used to determine the ship's position at sea. And that was true, for centuries, and it was true right up through the time of the privateering from Baltimore. There are 9 original privateer logbooks in the MCHC library. These are 4 of them, and as I was saying, I mean, they were kept for many years to determine the position at sea by noting data from the speed and the courses that were going on during the day-to-day operation.
So you mentioned the note the location, and that's interesting because obviously today we have GPS, right? We have systems that can track us to the point. In the 1800s, it must have been incredibly challenging. How did the captain know the longitude and latitude that they would list in the logbooks?
Yeah, right, and that's a great question with a lot of details. But the logbooks are shown. A couple of examples of those logbooks are shown here. On the left side, we see the logbook from the schooner Mammoth, and you see it's in a kind of formalized format there that's pre-printed, and you can see that there's navigation data in the 6 columns on the left. You're looking at H for hours of the day in the first column, K is knots, F is fractions of a knot, so that's the ship speed in knots and fractions of a knot. The course that's steered is given in the next column, and the wind direction in that final column. And then there's a little column called leeway, which is often not used. But that's the data that's used to calculate the ship's position by dead reckoning. So if you know the course and you know the speed, you know how much progress you've made during the day. And the result of that kind of calculation is given in this line down at the bottom. You see latitude and longitude here. In this case, you also have the latitude by observation. That would be the noon sighting by sextant of the sun's altitude. That gives you a latitude by a pretty straightforward and traditional calculation. So it's complicated because the longitude was really fraught with error in terms of this dead reckoning approach to calculation. In later time, we had chronometers were available, but they were not yet available to the Baltimore privateering captains in the War of 1812. So other logbooks also just had kind of less formalized formats. Here you see logbook from the schooner America on the right here, and every day's entry is just a big paragraph, and that same kind of paragraph is found over in the formalized version of a logbook, and it's called Remarks on Board, and you have a captain's account of daily shipboard events from day to day. And that's really up to the captain. He always talks about weather, but he's talking about problems on board, crew problems, what kind of ships he's encountering at sea, maybe what kind of land he's sighting, et cetera. Different captains had different approaches, but those remarks were really going to be used by the ship's owners when the voyage was over, to think about, okay, how are we going to plan the next voyage? How are we going to make more money from privateering the next time around? And that was all information. You know, is this really a good captain? So all this is kind of information that's being used in the privateering business to think about plans for the future.
I wanna hit on something that you said. You said planning of the voyages, and I'm gonna ask Fred this question. Who planned the voyages? Was it the Navy dictating where these privateers went, or was it the owners?
No, the Navy had nothing to do with it. The owners would give a set of instructions to their master, or just give them complete discretion as to where and when to go and where to sail. But the Navy only could control its own ships, and sometimes not so well there. But privateers were privately owned, and they were responsible. Matter of fact, if I may, there's a great quote from Thomas Jefferson, who was the ex-president at the time, and he's writing a letter in February 1813 to a man named Theodorus Bailey. And it's just several sentences, but I think this goes to your point, Alex. He said, I think with you on the subject of privateers, our ships of force, meaning the Navy, will undoubtedly be blockaded by the enemy, and we shall have no means of annoying them at sea, but by small, swift sailing vessels. These will be better managed and more multiplied in the hands of individuals than of the government. In short, they are our true and only weapon in a war against Great Britain. And Jefferson goes on to say, in point of real injury and depredation on the enemy, our privateers without question have been the most effectual. So what this goes to is that Jefferson was perfectly content. Now it's true, he's the ex-president at the time, but I think this was really what everyone thought at the time. He was very content with letting the privateers do their thing and let the profit motive guide them as to where best to sail to prey on British trade.
I gotcha. So I want to jump back into these logbooks for a second, because you mentioned, Fred, that they would jot down their targets, their past. But Pierre, I want to kind of ask you, who was in charge of keeping these logbooks? Whose job was it?
Yeah, well, basically, it was the captain's responsibility to keep this logbook. Obviously, sometimes officers would make entries and so on, but I think largely it was the captain. It's a little hard to figure, but just reading these handwritten logbooks, it looks like there's usually a pretty consistent handwriting. I must say it's amazing that the handwriting was as good as it was, thinking about these boats bouncing around in the open ocean. But let me just add one other thing that ties into something Fred said. One of the aspects of a privateering logbook that was important was the fact that they were going to be used by those courts to certify that this was a legitimate capture. And that meant mostly that the prizes really had to be British, and the cargo that was to be sold would be British, because that was really the primary driver for the rules of privateering. And here's you see a page from the 1812 logbook of Thomas Boyle's first cruise, in which he's certifying that this is a true statement of events on board. And he's got some notary signing him in, and there you see his signature. So this is another aspect of the logbook that plays into what Fred was saying. It's all part of a legal system.
Yeah, so you mentioned that it's part of the legal system, and obviously the accuracy needs to be kept. There have to be checks. So who would check it? What was the system of checks for the logbook, especially when they wanted to give a prize or go to court over a prize? The admiralty courts, who would check these?
Well, the courts would have people that were trained to do this. I mean, I'm not sure I have an answer. It certainly don't get that from the logbooks, because this is all when the logbook was leaving the control of the ship.
And so would the owners inspect the logbooks after the ship returned?
Oh yes, so the logbooks went to the owners at own, and as I was saying, I mean, they were using them for planning the next voyage and helping making more money.
Interesting. So we've talked about how the logbooks kind of kept track of like what the privateers did, and I kind of want to jump back to the role the privateers played in the War of 1812. And Fred, I want to ask you, how many British ships did the privateers actually capture? Did they target British naval vessels, or were they mostly going after merchant vessels?
Well, let me answer the second part of that question first. They definitely did not seek out British warships. They tried to avoid British warships at all costs, although there are many reported instances where privateers had to fight British warships, and we could go into that separately. They certainly did go after enemy merchant ships because that's where the money was. They were not out for glory, they were out for money. And so the answer to your question really is interesting, because here we are 200 years later, and you would think there's a definitive answer. But you get all sorts of different responses depending upon who the writer is and what sources they have. So some of the British historians tend to deprecate the value of American privateering. And so they draw on numbers from Lloyd's of London or whatever and try to say this was not such a big deal. And anyway, so many of the American captures were then recaptured by the British as they tried to get into the United States. But here are the best numbers. At the time, there was a Baltimore newspaper called NILES Weekly Register. And NILES estimates that, or actually cataloged, approximately 1,750 captures by American privateers. Now, in 30 months, that's a lot. That's, 60 a month. Although Niles says that he's underestimated this, there's undoubtedly more that he just wasn't able to find. In any case, of the 1,750, about 750 of those were recaptured, according to Niles, were recaptured by the British before they could make it to an American port and be held to be a valid prize and then sold. So they were a complete loss. The bottom line is, I mentioned before that there are 122 Baltimore privateers. The Baltimore privateers captured approximately 550 British merchant ships. That's a very big number. And we don't really know, that's about 4.5 enemy ships captured per privateer. And we don't really know exactly what percentage of the owners made money. It's roughly assumed that some people think that the majority of owners did make money, but that's probably not right. Certainly it's not right nationally. It may be right in Baltimore, but probably about a third made substantial amounts of money. And the other 2/3 probably either broke even or lost money. And as I mentioned in my earlier comments, some people lost a great deal of money. So there's this huge variety of results, but to answer your question precisely, Alex, nobody really knows how many ships were captured. Nobody really knows exactly how many ships made it back to America for sale, because by the end of the war, the effect of the British blockade meant that a lot of the privateer captains, even though they wouldn't make any money, they just burned the British ship, or they tried to send the British ship that they captured into another port, another country's port, France or Norway or Spain. And sometimes this was successful and sometimes this was not. So it's a very murky story. And I think the real point is that the chance of making huge profits is what drew so many people in, not the reality.
So from your studies, how would you say that did the privateers make a difference in the War of 1812 as an entity, as sailing ships?
Well, I'll take a stab at that, and I know that Pierre probably has an opinion on that. Perhaps Karl does too. By the 1814 and 1815, the war ended at the very end of 1814, or the very beginning of January of 1815. By the end of the war, or towards the end of the war, the U.S. Navy was almost completely blockaded in. So part of the answer to your question, Alex, is that privateers is all that the United States had on the water. That was it. So whether or not it was incredibly successful, it was important. And when you look at the effect of privateers, it depends how you weigh things. One of the things that I've discovered is that with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon was sent into exile, the British insurance rates did not come down. So if you think about that, the French were the great mortal enemies of the British. And if the insurance rates did not come down, why would that be? It would be because the great threat to their ships at sea were the American privateers. So one British historian says that something like 7.5% of all British merchant ships were captured by American privateers. So you can say that that is a huge effect. On the other hand, you could say if it doesn't really change the British attitude towards the war or encourage them to a peace settlement, maybe it didn't have a huge effect. It's a very debatable proposition among historians.
Pierre, Karl, do you want to add on to that at all?
No, I just would have, examples where British merchant shipping was required to be escorted by Royal Navy ships that were taken away from potential naval forces that would be deployed against France. So it did influence it in the sense that it sucked off some of the Royal Navy.
Pierre, up on the screen, you have the cruise of the clipper Chassew.
Yeah, so this is one of the logbooks that's in the MCHC library that I found, is really my favorite. It's the final cruise, really a final privateering cruise of the war. It started in December of 1814, when the war was just about over anyway, but they didn't know that. And this was a cruise from by, again, our successful captain, Baltimore Captain Thomas Boyle, in his large final ship, the Chassew. And this was headed down to the Caribbean because he thought that there would be more ships that would be capable of being captured and then sailed back to the U.S. for income. His previous cruise had a lot of excitement because he was up there in British waters and was actually, outsailing the Royal Navy in there. But on the other hand, when they captured those ships, they couldn't get them back to the States very well. And so, the profits weren't so great, and he thought the profits would be better down here in the Caribbean. And so here you see, just using that logbook data of latitude and longitude, I plotted this map, and we're getting a little short on time here, but there's a lot of interesting events that really tell us something about Baltimore clippers and their sailing abilities and limitations. And so, for example, here you see 4 days leaving New York in December. They're headed south towards the Caribbean, but they get hit by a gale. And so here's a logbook from that those days. And all I can say is it describes tremendous damage to the rigging. They were anticipating big weather, and they got some stuff down to lower the weight up high, but they still got slammed by a lot of strong winds. They lost their main boom. They were trying to repair it. The deck was full of water. And then there's this really dramatic statement: lost John McConkie overboard by the wash of the sea and never saw him more. So these were lightly built ships, and they were not high up off the water the way the British ships were, because the British waters were fraught with storms all the time, and these ships were designed for the Chesapeake. They were lightly built, and John McConkie would get lost overboard if he wasn't really watching. So this is just a dramatic case that the logbook really brings out. But really, the logbooks really detail the events of this privateering cruise. I've indicated when prizes were captured by orange stars on this map here, and they spent a month down there in the Lesser Antilles capturing ships. They got 5 prizes during that month. And three of them were small. They just took cargo off of those and then burned them. But 2 of them were big, and they put prize crews on board and sailed it back to the U.S. And they were declared legitimate prizes, and that was income for the Chasseurs owners and crew. And so then, after that, they actually did find this big convoy of merchant ships that was really resupplying and getting the sugar off of the major colonies, in particular Jamaica. And so there was a sort of weeks-long cat and mouse game between the Chasseur and this 110 vessel convoy. And so there was a lot of interesting sailing going along, a lot of chasing by the Royal Navy escorts, and some of those are marked here. They actually captured a couple of stragglers from that convoy and sent one of them back again for prizes. They kept on doing this cat and mouse game with the convoy for weeks until the convoy started heading back and rounded Cuba and started heading back. And there they got into a real fight with the Royal Navy. And that was probably the most famous event on this cruise. It's depicted in this lithograph because it's the only case where an American privateer fought and beat a Royal Navy ship. And this is the depiction of that as a lithograph that was, created later after this fame became known. Here you see the Chasseur on the left flying the American flag. And interestingly enough, you see it's a Baltimore clipper by virtue of its rakes, stem, stern, and mast, but it's actually rigged as a brig, so it has square sails on the foremast. But the HMS St. Lawrence is over here, and it is in fact a Baltimore clipper. It's got a topsail schooner rig, and this lithograph depicts the final stage of the battle in which the British flag on the St. Lawrence is being lowered in a sign of surrender. And you see that this battle has resulted in all kinds of cannonball holes in the sails. But the logbook, of course, has a lot more details, and it's pretty gory stuff. Blood flowing across the deck and out to scuppers. Wounded and killed men. So the Chasseur was losing 5 men killed, 7 men wounded, 4 of them, quote, maimed for life. So this was a pretty bloody battle, but it really depicts the strength of American privateer sailors, because they were really veterans at this, and in the case of the British, these were British Navy guys that took over the St. Lawrence after it had been captured by the Royal Navy and then recommissioned with a mission to go out and capture American privateers. So this is really a testimony to the sailing properties of those Baltimore clippers, because here you had the Royal Navy, which had lots of ships, but if they wanted to really have success capturing American privateers, the best way to do it was to use a Baltimore clipper. So that really is, I think, a real testimony to the British admiration for these Baltimore clippers.
Did you find this logbook of the Chasseur? Where'd you find it?
So this is one of those 9 original logbooks in the MCHC library, and it was really a great privilege for me to go up there and look at these day-to-day details. And I've shown some of these other logbook pages, but I think we're getting short on time, so I won't go into them. But it really provided us with getting this big picture of the whole event. And after that major battle, you're getting to the point where the Chasseur was getting low on men, because they had to put a whole bunch of prize crews on board these prizes, and they had some men killed and wounded. And by the time you're 2.5 months out, it's time to head back. And you see here, going back to New York, the logbook depicts this retreat back to New York to end the cruise, and off the coast of New Jersey encounters an American ship that says, "Hey guys, the war's over. You can go back to Baltimore." So they turn back and go into the Chesapeake, and the logbook ends when the Chasseur is sailing up the Chesapeake inside of Point Lookout. But I think an appropriate way to end this little story of the Chasseur's cruise is to look at NILES Weekly Register, which Fred mentioned, is a very prominent newspaper of the day, based in Baltimore. And here you see the newspaper report of the Chasseur's return to Baltimore. The Chasseur, the Pride of Baltimore, arrived at Baltimore on Sunday evening last and saluted Fort McHenry. She is perhaps the most beautiful vessel that ever floated on the oceans. Those who have not seen our schooners have but little idea of her appearance. As you look at her, you may easily figure to yourself the idea that she's about to rise out of the water and fly in the air, seeming to sit so lightly upon it. She has carried terror and alarm through the West Indies, as appears by numerous extracts from West India papers received by her, and was frequently chased by British warships, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, here you have a journalist impression rather than just looking at all those gritty details in the logbooks.
So I want to quickly kind of look at the legacy of the Baltimore Clipper and its service. And so, Karl, I want to kind of ask you the last question. When did the Baltimore Clipper design fade out, and did the Baltimore Clipper design influence later sailing ships?
It did fade out in a way, but in another way, it persisted in a huge legacy way and made Baltimore Clippers a very important part of the development of sailing ships. I have two examples to show. This is a picture of a model and a painting of a vessel built in Baltimore called the Ann McKim. She was built around 1830, and she has some of the appearance of a Baltimore Clipper, but notice that she has a ship rig, and she was built to be used in the merchant service. And a lot of people feel she was the transition, the sort of magic fossil that they found that connects the Baltimore Clipper to the later well-known Clipper ships. So that was one thing, one direction. Another direction was into smaller vessels. And in this case, the Baltimore Clippers led to pilot boats, which eventually led to the schooner yacht America, which won the America's Cup. So there were just a lot of different descendants from the original development, and it was a very important part of the history of naval architecture. This is a picture of the Baltimore Clipper at the top and a privateer, and the bottom is the schooner yacht America, and you can see the similarities.
Great. Well, we covered a really long history of the Baltimore Clippers in a very short amount of time, and I want to thank you all so much for joining us. And there are a lot of questions, and so if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a couple. The first one that I want to ask is were there any instances of privateers initiating combat against a naval vessel? And whoever wants to answer that can jump in.
Well, let me just say that the example I cited of the Chassew and the St. Lawrence was one, that was a trap by the naval vessel. It was disguised to look like a merchant vessel. So you can't say that Captain Boyle initiated that encounter, even though he came out on top. It was not his choice. And in fact, he wrote a letter to the owners apologizing for this battle because, that wasn't going to help their profits. So were there any British ships? One of the questions talks about, were any classes of British warships capable of matching the speeds and maneuverability of the privateers in the War of 1812? Karl, why don't you do that one?
Yeah, interestingly enough, the British captured a lot of privateers and a lot of Baltimore Clipper types. And interestingly, what they did was they tended to modify them after they took command of them because they thought they were too lightly built and had rigs that were too large. And so they tended to stiffen them up and cut the rigs down, and they were never as good in performance once they did that. But they certainly did use those vessels, and they used them, as in the case of the St. Lawrence, as part of their war effort.
One of the questions we have is, were Clippers integrated into the U.S. Navy at all? And if so, how are they rated?
Oh, well, the answer to that is yes. There are several examples of ships that had the Baltimore Clipper design that were brought into the Navy even earlier. So there was a schooner called the Nautilus that sailed, which was bought from a merchant named Thomas Tennant in Baltimore, and anyway, had a good career in the Navy. And then there were hull shapes and sailing rigs for two others. One was called the Experiment, one was called the Enterprise. And of course, the Enterprise is a very famous name in American naval history. There have been all sorts of ships named Enterprise, but either the first or the second one was based on Baltimore Clipper lines. So the answer to the question is yes, there were several schooners taken into the Navy or built for the Navy that essentially were Baltimore clippers, yes.
One question we have is, have any of you ever come across an example of British privateers during the War of 1812? Or is privateering mostly an American action?
No, I certainly during the Revolutionary War time, there were British privateers. And in fact, there were privateers that were operated by loyalists in the Chesapeake Bay to try to interfere with American shipping.
And even later, there were British privateers, even though the pickings were slim because the British blockade of France was pretty good. But there were some British privateers that were aimed mostly against Napoleonic France. Although obviously if Britain were also at war with America, as occurred between 1812 and 1815, the Americans were fair game. But there were not that many American merchant ships at sea precisely because of the blockade.
So privateering by Britain went back for centuries. So it was not new to even the 18th century.
So I have two final questions that are in the chat, and I'm going to kind of put them together. What would happen if a privateer didn't have its letter of marque? How would it be treated? And then the second question is, what would happen to the crews of the ships that were captured by privateers? Would the crews be sent home? Would they be sent to prison in the US? What would be their fate?
Okay, so those are great questions. So if a privateer did not have a license, they could be treated as a pirate, and pirates could be hanged. It was really important to hold on to that piece of paper. It was very important. If the privateer was captured and the crew, obviously with the ship, were captured, they typically were treated as prisoners of war. And there was a famous British prison near Halifax, Nova Scotia, called Melville Prison. And there were 2 or 3 other prisons in Britain, in Exeter and Devon, that were pretty horrible places. So yes, they were treated as prisoners of war. They were sometimes maltreated, but the number of American privateersmen who became prisoners of war far, far exceeded the number of American naval sailors who had been captured during the war. I mean, the number is in the thousands.
Well, so that's kind of the end of our questions. You know, there were more questions, and we might send that out to you all to kind of respond to, and we might send that out to everyone else when they get a recording of this. But I want to thank you, gentlemen, so much for taking your time to meet with us. I do want to promote our exhibit called The Unfinished Revolution, Maryland and the Wars for Independence, which does look at the Baltimore Clippers. It has a section that looks at the Baltimore Clippers and the privateer, and you'll see some of the models. You'll see a model of the Chassew on display as well, and talk a little bit more about the privateer fleet. I also want to suggest coming down and looking at some of the logbooks that we have in our library. That is an open research library, so feel free to come and visit.
Yes, thank you all so very much for joining us, and thank you out there for joining us, and stay tuned. We will have more events, programs in person and virtual coming this summer, so stay tuned for that. Thank you, Fred, Pierre, and Karl, and Alex, and everyone for their questions. Take care.